Great. Okay.
So if we could start then. Is that all right, everyone?
Yeah,
Yes.
let's go ahead.
Okay. Apologies for absence. I had an email from Ben Hayhurst to say he wasn't attending. That's all I've heard. Anyway, are there any others?
I've had none.
Okay. Are there any declarations of interest from members that should be declared at this point? Take that as a no, or no new ones. Minutes for the previous meeting, and we have the minutes from the special meeting, I think, on the 17th of February. I won't go through them page by page, but can we agree them as a true record, or is there any issue that anyone wants to bring to our attention before we do that? Can we agree them then? I suppose you put your hand up to show what do you do actually, because I can't see everybody. Yeah, I'll take that as agreed. I can see enough of you to see some majority.
If helpful, Rob, I took to doing a slightly painful register in Cabinet Procurement Committee. That's the only way around not being able to see everyone.
I can see enough of you to see it's a majority anyway. The only thing I wanted to raise in the minutes was under the any other business thing. We discussed the rescheduling of the employer's contribution, which we've given effect to by officer action since this meeting, which I understand you were all copied into at the time. Yeah. Right. Okay then. Any other observations from anybody on that? No, so I can't see the chat here. Let's just make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, then, so we can move then to item 5, COVID impact update. Now, we circulated a report from Ian Williams at the end of May, I think, with quite a lot of details in it, and this is an update from that. So I think over to Rachel to introduce it, please.
Yep, that's fine. So there's not a huge amount of additional detail in this report relative to the previous one. It just provides a little update on sort of where we've got a little bit more clarity since that report was sent out back in May. So it touches on the impact of mainly administration and funding that we've seen over the last few months. Essentially, what we've seen is clearly since March, we saw a very, very steep deterioration in the funding position. So that dropped down from I think about 95% in late February, and that dropped all the way down to about 75 was about the lowest estimated funding position that we hit. Since then, we have seen, I think, a surprisingly sharp recovery really in asset values, and the funding levels now I think about 80. The estimate's about 88%. When I looked at it yesterday, what I would caution, I suppose, is that obviously these funding positions, they're an estimate, but B, they can only represent a very, very brief snapshot in time. So essentially, although we have seen a strong recovery in asset values, obviously we can't say whether or not that will be sustained. Perhaps I think our feeling is that it doesn't necessarily reflect some of the information that's, some of the economic information that's coming through. So essentially, I would say treat it with a little bit of scepticism. I think Henry had a question.
Yes, please. It was just a thought while I'm looking at this report. I mean, the markets are plunging again today and seem likely to be volatile for ages. I'm just wondering, is there a funding figure at which point we would start looking seriously at increasing employer contributors or something like that? I guess anything over 85% I'm reasonably comfortable at. But I suppose a figure below 6% start raising alarm bells. I just wondered if we red light threshold at which point we'd have to start looking pretty seriously about other ways of funding the plan? I'm sure there probably is, but that was my question.
Rachel?
No, it's a good question. So the way that we've considered funding is very much by employer, and obviously we've taken advice from the fund actuary, and also there has been sort of wider guidance that's come out around this issue for the LGPS. The view that we've taken essentially is that if we look at the employers that make up sort of, that contribute to the Hackney Pension Fund, the largest by far is obviously Hackney Council, and as well as that, it's schools and its academies. As employers, we would view those as having that they have, that itself has tax raising powers. All are essentially public bodies. So the view that we would take of those employers is that the 3 year contribution, the 3 year sort of contribution arrangement we have in place for them at the moment, we've taken advice from the actuary, and for the time being, we certainly regard that as remaining suitable. Obviously, as you say, funding levels can be very volatile, and we do obviously review that. But our view at the moment is that we are likely to be able to hold contributions stable for those employers, and the way those rates are set as well, design essentially stabilised. They're intended to be able to weather a certain amount of volatility, given the length of the time horizon on these employers and the very strong covenant that they have. Where we do focus a little bit more on individual employers is on those smaller employers who often have a shorter term relationship with the fund, and for those, we do have to keep an eye on their funding level. We do so on a case by case basis, and obviously, we are mindful. Given if we do see a more sustained deterioration in the funding level, we may need to look again at some employer contribution rates, and obviously that's something that we discuss with affected employers if and when that happens.
Thank you. But in respect, is there a very simple threshold that we can apply? I mean, if you're looking on a case by case basis, if we give a 70%.
No, we don't have a fixed percentage under which we say this is no longer suitable. No.
Okay.
It's worth saying, isn't it, the cash flow position of the fund stays very stable, and like.
So
without relying heavily on investment income at this point in time.
In terms of where we are at present, we have seen a drop in terms of how cash flow positive the fund is. So we were quite strongly cash flow positive, less so now. Although the reasons for that haven't been related to the coronavirus pandemic. We are still, for the vast majority of our employers, we have still seen contributions paid on time. The reasons behind the change in cash, the reasons behind the change in cash flow have related more to.
Okay, thank you. Then I've got Cam Adams, Councillor Adams.
Oh, thank you, Rob. My question is kind of related to the cash flow as well. On page 10 of the booklet, you put it, it's written as the fund is currently marginally cash flow positive. So I'm just wondering, in a situation where we have second waves of coronavirus, what impact will that have on the cash flow?
So if we do have, the way the fund is likely to be affected directly by coronavirus in terms of its cash flows, is if we start to see employers unable to pay their contributions. Funds employers, as we're looking at the council, we're looking at maintained schools, and we're looking at academies. We would regard those employers as essentially they do have, they are public sector employers. The council itself has tax raising powers. We would regard those employers as stable and essentially quite very unlikely not to pay. We have explored the possibility that some of our smaller employers may not pay, and we have had a couple of requests for deferral from employers, and so we're building a set of principles for sort of to make sure that we deal fairly with individual employers. What I would say is that we have a certain proportion of our investments held in actually quite near cash assets. So we have essentially, if we were forced to, we do have a substantial pool of cash and near cash that we hold that we could draw on. So that comes both from cash held with the administrator, it comes from cash held in money market funds as well. So we do have provision made to be able to deal with shorter term disruption to our cash flows. So we think essentially that we are prepared in the event that there is a second wave. We could, we make sure that we maintain enough cash to meet benefit payments with the administrator, and that we're confident we could pay our bills. So,
thank you. Thanks.
So, okay, Cam.
Thank you. Yes, Rob.
Councillor Desmond. Michael. It's gone. Looks like we've lost Councillor Desmond somewhere. Oh, well, I can see him. He's frozen, isn't it? Okay.
He needs to unmute himself. It's on mute.
Yeah. No, I think he's frozen.
Can I queue jump whilst we're waiting for Michael?
Okay. Yeah. Well, there's no other questions.
Hello?
Yes. Do you want to ask a question? Who was that? Sorry, it was Rebecca, was it?
I'm not. Can you hear me?
Hello, Michael. Oh,
Hello?
yeah, Michael. You want to ask a question? We go back to
Lovely
Michael Desmond.
Hello? Yeah.
I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me? I think. All right. So all I wanted to. Hello, Rachel. Hope you're well. I wanted to know about the liquidity of our commercial investments. Obviously, with the internet and all other factors, I was concerned about liquidity issues before, and now with the virus, the evidence is the last rent day, which was 3 months ago, only about 59% was received by commercial landlords. Today actually is a rent day. So I wanted to know about that. Secondly, if it's not commercially sensitive, have you any update on our American investment? You remember that we looked at some ideas and went ahead, and these were companies that were getting loans, and we thought the rate that we'd obtain in terms of the yield would be quite high. But obviously under COVID, there could be issues with that. And well, just those two for the moment. I think that's fine.
Sure. So in terms of our property portfolio, at the moment, both the property funds that we invest in are still actually gated. So at the moment, we cannot buy or sell from those funds. We are comfortable with that position. And it's a position that we view as having been taken by the manager in the interests of investors in the funds. It doesn't relate to essentially large attempted withdrawals. Instead, Instead, it relates to there's an awful lot of uncertainty over property market valuations. So essentially, to make sure that it's fair to the investors in the fund, the manager has taken the decision to suspend trading. So essentially, at the moment, those assets certainly are not liquid. When we look at our property portfolio in general, we would not regard those as liquid assets. Although in normal times, you can, in theory, trade daily. The underlying assets are highly illiquid anyway. So it's not a portfolio that we would regard as generally liquid, and I think we remain comfortable with it.
Could I possibly just comment on addition on the property
please,
side of things, Rachel, if that's okay? I'm sure. So I guess just in general market terms, I think a lot of landlords in commercial properties have been empowered essentially to say we're not paying rent, and there's little that, let's say, the asset manager can actually do in that scenario. So therefore, the onus is very much on them to maintain the relationships and focus on how potentially over the longer term they can actually make sure those become deferred payments rather than defaulted payments, if you like. And that is a bit of a challenge. So I think there is an expectation in commercial property for the income yield which comes from those assets to be lower in the short term, but potentially to recover over the longer term. But that's something which is impacting income in general on asset classes like property, also asset classes like private lending, where really the onus is on the asset managers to work with their tenants and or sort of contractual counterparties to sort of work through the kind of unprecedented and challenging situation that we're currently in.
Thank you. Did Councillor Renison want to ask a question?
I did. Thanks, Rob. Apologies if I missed this earlier. I was having my own setup issues at the start. This feels like it's going to be a night of tech playing up. But it was just if there's been any official advice, whether from government or brain's gone blank on the correct name, official bodies, around how we should be managing pension funds at this time of uncertainty.
So yes, there has been some guidance put out from various quarters. It tends not to be direct from government, but we have had advice. We've had advice issued by the pensions regulator. We have had some advice out from the LGPS scheme advisory board. So yes, that's the type of guidance that we've been following. There's, perhaps unsurprisingly, there's nothing, we haven't had sort of communication direct from central government. But yes, we do receive more specialised advice, and we are acting on it.
Okay, Karen, is Karen waving? Yeah.
Thank you. I thought it would be quicker to wave than type. Just to add on with what Rachel is saying there is also an LGPS practitioners group that's linked to the Scheme Advisory Board and also MHCLG. So we are getting opportunities to feed into that group if we're looking for specific advice in any area. So if you do feel that central government or SAB advice is lacking in any places, do let us know. We can feed into that group. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think from my point of view, it's more that the speed of response has been, I think, better from more specialist bodies than it has from MHCLG, which is, I think, not necessarily surprising.
I just want to, when this first started, I sort of made the point with the officers that I think the main concern initially was to make sure that we maintain the service, both ourselves and Equinity, in terms of paying pensioners and dealing with new cases and issues like that. It does seem like, given all the disruption, that they've managed all that quite well. So thanks for that. But I just wondered if you've got any comment on how that's going, or any particular issues that might have arisen in administering the fund as opposed to its funding itself.
So, sort of contingency arrangements for administration are essentially working. Equiniti, so Equiniti were able to put emergency arrangements in place quite quickly to, as obviously they deal with our pension and payroll. They've got, their payroll service is well prepared and well established. So they were able to move quite quickly to a full working from home arrangement. What we have done is made a few changes to processes for people contacting Equiniti, around individual pension cases, so obviously a lot of that is around provision of sort of hard copy documents and attendance at the council in person. Obviously we've had to adapt a little bit to more remote working. So those temporary arrangements are still in place and are working.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? If not, can we note that report? Yeah, I'll take that as noted. Okay then, so item number 6 is the investment strategy review. Okay, how are we going to deal with this? I'll start with Rachel and then we'll move over to a short presentation from Andrew, I think.
Yeah. So this report presents two things. First of all, it presents this is now the second edition. It's a revised timetable for development of the fund's investment strategy, which you can find at Appendix 1. What it also does is it requests essentially a technical update to the existing investment strategy statement. So what we're looking for is, rather than ask you to approve on the spot, and it is update the previous statement to take account of the fact that since it was approved, actually all the way back in April, I think it was in 2017, we have actually moved a large proportion of the fund's assets to different management arrangements. So we're essentially trying to make sure that the refreshed statement maintains our existing strategy, but just reflects the fact that changes have been made. It's also to make sure that we are compliant with statutory requirements around how often we refresh it. So we do have a legal requirement to routine. So I don't know quite which order you'd like to take the paper in. I'm happy to start with the investment strategy review timetable, if that suits, and then we can look at the sort of technical updates to the statement. Rob, if that suits you.
Yeah, that's okay. I was viewing the technical update to the statement as just that, as not a huge issue. My understanding is we're simply with just a few tweaks, just rolling on our 2016-17 investment strategy arrangement, and it'll just stay in place because we've got to have one until we go through the exercise we're now about to undertake to come up with our new investment strategy.
Yes. So it essentially once the current exercise is complete, we'll have a completely refreshed one for you. Right. This is just around the fact that we have a statutory deadline to meet, and we also need to tell the government what proportion of our assets we currently hold on the London CIV, which looked a little bit out of date on the previous one.
Okay, and so we'll come back to that when we do the timetable. Okay, so who wants to talk about the timetable? Is that you or Andrew?
I'm happy to very quickly run through the timetable, and then I think Andrew has a very short deck of slides.
This runs on, doesn't it, from our from the workshop we had with Karen Shackleton before I can't remember what it was now, but before beginning of the year, end of last year, beginning of the year, wasn't it?
Yes, no, we held that.
Well, we need to
turns out
now
it was all the way
continue on
back
from that process, don't we? As well as doing the formal things that Andrew will set out in a minute.
Yes. So obviously we held that workshop all the way back on the 9th of March. Then obviously we had a cancelled committee. We had hoped to hold a workshop at some point during the spring, but obviously sort of events intervened. So the point we've hit now is obviously the 24th of June committee. So I've set out in the timetable just what sort of, just what's under discussion at this meeting. Following this, what we would like to do is, rather than one longer workshop, which would have been sort of in the spring, we'd now like to hold, sort of up to two, I think two slightly shorter workshops would be the way we're thinking about it, given the constraints around virtual meetings. And what the aim of those would be, first of all, to follow on from our discussions on the 9th of March. So to really start looking at taking some of those discussions and coming up with some more formal climate and responsible investment objectives. But what we also need to do is to start considering essentially considering the fund's potential new asset allocation. So think about essentially the long-term investment aims of the fund. So linking it back to our funding objectives and the valuation. Thinking about what type of assets we want to be invested in. Are we happy with our current asset allocation? I'd like to look at the fund's approach to currency hedging, and also consider sort of how, what our relationship with the London CIV and sort of any further assets we might plan to put on there. So it's really an opportunity. It's intended as an opportunity for essentially for the committee to discuss in as much detail as you like, really, sort of precisely how we're going precisely sort of how we put a new asset allocation together, and what your priorities in doing that might be. When we move on to the formal committee meetings, it's then starting to look very much more at at formal documentation of a lot of this, and actually being able to make formal decisions on how to proceed. So looking at a formal review of investment strategy, setting out an implementation timeline, and also considering our approach to voting and engagement, since that's something that we need to consider as part of any responsible investment policy we set. And then we're looking at the December committee to hopefully be able to finalise the strategy, actually be able to document and bring together some of the RI issues, hopefully in a responsible investment policy statement. So it is quite an ambitious timetable. Given that we did essentially lose the spring to the pandemic, so it may need to be a little bit flexible. But what we are trying to do is sort of divide it up so that we do provide lots of opportunity for discussion, so that then once we move on to the more formal decision making stages, everyone is confident of sort of how we've come to those decisions. I don't know if anyone wants to ask questions now, or if you'd like us to cover the. Andrew's got the introduction to it.
Sorry, I don't know who's talking. Rachel, unless hello.
Very sorry, I missed that.
Right. What I was going to suggest is that unless there's any pressing questions to you now, we actually hold comments and questions on the timetable and the process until Andrew's gone through his presentation on basically what it is we've got to do. I think is what you're going to talk about, Andrew, isn't it?
Yeah, that sounds
So
good.
would that make sense? And then we'll have a discussion on both bits. Yeah. Okay. So
Yep.
Andrew, if everyone's happy with that,
Yep, no, that sounds good. I will mute myself.
Andrew.
Okay, perfect. So hopefully in a few seconds, if not already, you should be able to see my screen. And perhaps even before I start, just to, I guess, support what Rachel said, I think there's a lot to get through in the next sort of 3 to 6 months, or in the meetings that are set out in the timetable. So the benefits of having a few short and sharp, punchy meetings to sort of make progress in some of these items prior to, excuse me, decision making, would be in the committee meetings would be extremely helpful. 2 other small points I just wanted to make, reflecting on Cam and Henry's comments earlier. One, cash flow planning is a core part of what we do on an annual basis, and it's very much part of the timetable. And secondly, we also consider and discuss a de-risking framework. Recognizing, Henry, your question was specifically in relation to, let's say, the funding level drops that might cause reviewing of contribution aspects. Within the de-risking context, there is also the potential flexibility to consider re-risking of the investment strategy to address or capture any opportunities that may arise. But I will now move to the set of slides, which hopefully you can now see. Now there are quite a few slides here. I'm not planning on talking to them all, but they will be available to be circulated by Rachel subsequent to the meeting. I think the key thing, what I'll try and do is pick out the sort of 5 key slides, and hopefully do that in about 10 minutes or so, and then we can move up through to a discussion. So the first one I will start with is actually slide 3, and really the objective of this slide is to give context as to why. Yeah.
No, it's not.
No, I can't see them either. I've just left a message to that effect.
Says I'm presenting.
Are you in multiple screens, perhaps, Andrew?
How's that?
So, thank you.
Okay.
Working? Perfect. Okay, so I'll start with slide 3. And I guess the key objective here is really to put into context why the LGPS focuses on very long-term investment strategy. The chart on the left-hand side represents, I guess, the annual liabilities which are due to be paid based on, in green, past service benefits. So that means benefits of members who exist at the moment and that will be due to be paid in the future. And therefore, you can see within the green side of things, it increases for a period of time, peaks in 20 or 30 years' time, and then it's just tails off over time as pensioners become older or are no longer with us, and those pensions become fully paid. But for an LGPS scheme which is open and it is growing in number of participants, this blue side of things, which is new participants and future benefits accrual, therefore, as a result of that, the liabilities of the pension scheme are growing very much into perpetuity, and therefore, because of that, in simple terms, we are able to take a very long-term mindset when it comes to thinking about investment strategy. And on the right-hand side, we've just reiterating that the principal objectives of the pension scheme are to pay benefits to the members that as they are due, but also to keep contributions stable and affordable. And the priority of reviewing investment strategy is to align the funding of the investment scheme with the investment strategy. Slide 4 is very much a recap on the investment framework within which we advise you as a pension fund, and it essentially breaks down asset classes into an opportunity set of growth, income, and protection. Growth asset classes are intended really to deliver the returns that are required in order to meet your long-term objectives. Income asset classes really to help generate income in order to pay the pensions as they become due, but also deliver a little bit more flexibility or a little bit more predictability in relation to the returns that they provide. But the returns that they do provide are primarily as a result of income paid from the sort of lending and so on which takes place. And protection assets classes are ones that move a bit more like, they have characteristics that are more aligned with how those liabilities, the liabilities of the pension scheme. So, for example, the pension benefits are linked to inflation to a degree. So the protection side of things is asset classes which have characteristics which are more aligned to the liabilities themselves. Slide, I'll jump quickly through to, so slide 5 really just shows the current asset allocation as shown typically within your quarterly reporting. And as you'll see, we always tend to break this down into growth asset classes, income asset classes, and protection asset classes. Growth being primarily your equity and DGF mandates, income generating assets being the private lending mandates which were funded over the recent sort of 12 to 18 months and are still in the process of being funded. Your property mandates which have a high reliance on income to generate their returns, and the protection mandates essentially the bonds and the cash funds that you hold which are more kind of predictable in nature. Slide 8 is really the key slide that I wanted to talk through today. And really, this schematic represents the process that we will go through as part of the investment strategy review. And it very much starts with setting of goals and objectives. We've already spent some time discussing establishing investment beliefs previously. One of the first things that we will do at our next meeting will be to review those investment beliefs and ensure they still stand. It will be there is the other aspect in here is to the value, I guess, thinking about the valuation and the objectives which are set and agreed within the valuation. And within the investment strategy work that we do, that will very much be consistent with the derivation of your contributions and so on and so forth. So that long-term objective that was agreed with Laura and co as part of the valuation, which is to have an objective of around a 70% probability of achieving 100% funding on gilts plus 1.65 over a 20-year time frame. That's something that will be a core sort of building block of the investment strategy work and the work that we do. So really aligning your valuation objectives with what their investments essentially are there to deliver and achieve. Once your goals and objectives are clear, and it's a core starting point, it's then possible to move into what the high level investment strategy would like to look like. So that will involve reviewing the split between growth, income and protection. And sorry, that was a comment from Henry, I just checked that. Sorry, Henry, that's okay. I'll keep going if that's okay. So this middle stage in terms of high-level investment strategy would really be to look at the split between growth, income and protection, make sure that the return and risk characteristics of the investment strategy are aligned with your objectives, and then an asset liability monitoring project will enable us to test that and also to look at different compositions of growth, income and protection assets to make sure that we're getting the best bang for your buck from your investment strategy, and we're not taking too much risk in order to achieve the return objectives. And as part of that, what we'll do is we will look at alternative investment strategies in suitable asset classes for the fund. Once the ALM work has been carried out, we will then move into a more detailed analysis of how to facilitate those buckets. So what are the growth and income asset classes which can deliver those returns, and actually think about how those can be provided to the scheme. So what has the London CIV got to offer? What other initiatives are there that could potentially facilitate the aspirations in growth and income assets? And really, that's when you get down to the kind of nitty-gritty of what mandates are going to be facilitating the returns and risk of the investment strategy. And those are the sort of three key steps. It starts with goals and objectives. You then move into the ALM work to think about the three key building blocks of growth, income and protection. And then it gets down to the sort of more detailed aspect of the actually what makes up those categories of growth, income and protection. And then as we move down to the bottom of the page, we've got implementation. Once that's something that I guess is taken away from the committee to a large degree, but then also monitoring of actually how what sort of job that's doing, and then perhaps this is a review loop that you might need to come back to if there are any I guess challenges that are sort of come through as part of that monitoring process. And as it says here, there is a process which is redone at least triennially and certainly if and when required. So that's a really key kind of sort of process schematic, which sort of gives you an illustration of what the process that we'll go through. Start with goals and objectives, move into the ALM, and then think about how it actually gets implemented further down the line. The next slide I think it's best to focus in on is probably the ALM process. So essentially the ALM process that we'll go through, and this is something that was used as part of Laura's work to establish the contribution patterns that would be agreed as part of the valuation process. So we can actually build from that work that Laura has done and refine it to have more of a focus on sort of lock down those contributions that have been agreed and refine it to think about different combinations of investment strategies and how those can be optimized in order to deliver the returns from the investment strategy. And essentially how that works is we run 5,000 economic scenarios of potential future return paths over different time periods to project to project forward the funding level of the scheme. We then summarize that in essentially diamonds and bars in very simple terms. And essentially the diamonds represent the probability of success. So what is the probability of being 100% funded on your long-term objective in 20 years time, for example? So the outcome would be targeting something in here which is shown as 66%. But the bars importantly also show what's the average of the 5% of worst outcomes. So really you've got visibility of the likelihood of achieving your objectives, but also what are the downside risks, what are the sort of average of the 1 in 20 scenarios where we don't achieve what we want to achieve in terms of bad outcomes. So that's something which you will have seen before as part of the valuation process, but it'll be refined to focus on investment strategies and different investment strategies rather than different contribution strategies. And the final point I really wanted to draw out here was that there will be additional analysis that we will carry out. That can be triggers. I'll not dwell into the detail of this stage, but really it's just to think about if the investment strategy and funding is ahead of target, could we potentially establish a trigger framework which is designed to reduce risk if we're ahead of target? That's something that has been in place for the last 2 valuation cycles. It's something that is on pause at the moment because of the revised assumptions around the valuation, but it's something that we'll come back to after we've done the investment strategy review. As Rachel mentioned, we will also look at different asset classes, different aspects of the investment strategy. So very much kick the tires of what we have in place at the minute. The UK global balance of the equity allocation, the currency hedge which is in place, the allocation to DGF managers, potentially extending allocations in the income space, and the role of the bonds mandate are just examples of that. The mix of active and passive. All of these are things which should be reviewed as part of this process. That will come through in the subsequent meetings. And finally, we also include additional analysis explicitly of climate scenario testing, and these are just 3 sort of headlines which we do use to sort of illustrate scenarios in terms of head in the sand, challenging times, green revolution. This is a subject we could spend an entire session on in itself. There is a link in these slides which goes to the booklet, which gives a lot more detail in terms of what sits behind them. But this is explicitly something that we will pick up as part of the scenario analysis that we will do as part of the asset liability modelling of the investment strategy as we move through the next few months. That was a very quick whistle stop through the strategy. As I say, the key bit is for me, it starts with setting your objectives you build from there in terms of the steps that we'll take over the coming months.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Obviously, we'll have an opportunity to go through some of that again as we start the process. Right. Can I just, are there any questions or comments on either what Andrew said or the timetable? That doesn't look like there are so far. I just wanted to pick up one thing. We talk about the review loop there. How have we got a view on how we're going to look at how successful our last investment allocation strategy was, and any lessons to be learned from that as part of this process?
Of course, and Rachel might want to chip in on this. It's something that Rachel and I have discussed as almost doing a decisions paper in terms of we have in the past looked at how the impact of, let's say, changing the benchmark of the BMO bonds mandate, which was refined in terms of the composition between gilts, index-linked gilts, and corporate bonds. What was the financial impact of refining that benchmark? Also the mix between global and UK equities, we have looked at that in the past. I think it's a really helpful thing to do, at least once every 3 years, if not more frequently. And I think as part of the CMA review and setting objectives for investment consultants, that's certainly something that we think will become a requirement for pension funds to do moving forward. So we can work with Rachel and co in terms of bringing some of that into the process at an early stage.
Yeah, and I think I'd just echo that, and just all I'd really add is say that, yeah, what I think we've discussed looking at is to try to, we can't look at everything, but is to pick out essentially to look at the big allocation decisions that the committee have made over the past 3 years, and look at what, as Andrew says, and look at what impact those have had. So yeah, to look at the shift between UK and global equity. So I think we can also look at the impact of the shift from active to passive, and as Andrew says, we can look at the impact of the changes to the BMO mandate. So yes, that is something that we are planning to cover.
Great. So has anyone else got any questions or comments? Are we happy with the timetable set out then, the process for going through that? Yeah? Yeah, okay. So if we can go, excuse me a second, to the recommendations in the reports. We're asked to note the revised timetable. Can we do that? Yeah. And now we've been asked to improve the interim investment strategy. Given, as I said earlier, this is a technical issue because we have to have one in place. It is essentially rolling over our 2016 strategy until we've got a new one. Are there any particular questions or comments on that, or can we agree to do that? Polly, I see you's waving. Councillor Billington.
Hi, yes, I just wanted to make the observation. Of course, we need to do the technical rollover, and also acknowledge that we will have a big job on our hands to be able to do this investment strategy review, because we will have so many levels of uncertainty about investment, as everybody has been pointing out. And I want us to be aware that just rescheduling what we currently have, what we currently had anticipated doing, might meet some of our needs, but we may well need to consider further aspects of our investment strategy that previously we would have thought of as certain, and therefore not needing to revisit. And I don't know whether that needs to be factored into our revised timetable now, or whether we need to acknowledge that we might need, again, in this sort of the new certainty is uncertainty, consider whether we need to expand that further in the future. I don't know what those things are, but the points raised by Councillor Desmond, for example, on property yields and so forth, mean that this is impacting on every single aspect of the economy, and therefore it will impact on every single aspect of our investments. And I don't think we should underestimate what that means for reviewing our investment strategy, which will last for 5 years. Is that right, Rob?
I think it's 3 currently. Maybe it's going to be 4, but is that right?
Either way, it's long enough that we'll need to think about
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that can I just that's a really important point, I think, Polly. And I think we did look at it when we're looking at the rest of the process, because there are going to be some really difficult things to consider. But if we go back to Rachel or Andrew or both for a comment on that.
yeah, so essentially funds we have a requirement to formally consider our and review our investment strategy statement every 3 years. Sometimes, you know, over a 3-year period, you know, for example, the 2017 investment strategy is quite a good example. Sometimes you do make quite substantial changes to the asset allocation. What I would point out is that in you know, we have had strategy cycles in the past where we haven't made such substantial changes. So there is a requirement on us to review it. That doesn't mean there is a requirement for necessarily, you know, wholesale change every 3 years. So yes, this strategy needs to be, you know, it's taking into account some very, very long-term factors. And you know, we would expect to be reviewing it every 3 years, but that doesn't necessarily mean we would, you know, that we are required to change it at every single review. In terms of the point around sort of the flexibility of the timetable, I recognise what we have got is quite ambitious, and I think if we do find that we do need to, you know, that we do need to extend it, potentially into the first quarter of 2021. I think I've got the right year there. That, you know, that can be done. It is, you know, it's not intended to be set in stone, and it is flexible if we absolutely need it to be.
And if I may, I completely echo
Andrew,
echo what Rachel said. I view, like, investment strategy reviews are not intended to be a revolution. It's very much evolution. And although there were very substantive changes which took place as a result of the 2017 review, if you actually look at that at the growth income protection level, it was relatively modest. A lot of it was driven by the LSIV evolution and so on, and development and so on and so forth. And I think that equally, while we're saying it might be 4 years before we review it again, I view investment strategy as something which is constantly part of your monitoring process. And if you have issues with managers, if asset class opportunities come along, that should be something that is addressed as part of the ongoing cycle. This is a stock take and a chance to almost say, right, let's just make sure we look at all the key areas. And if let's say, for example, if we come to the July meeting and I provide a list of 8 areas that we want to look at, and you say, actually, there's 2 more I want to look at, then let's do that at the next meeting and make sure that all of the, I guess, the components are moving in parallel as we work through the next few months, in order to address any other questions. So, agreed.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just worth, I think, reiterating that the whole business of the investment strategy decision, and particularly the asset allocation decision, is probably, in my view anyway, one of the most important things we do as a committee. And the asset allocation decision is absolutely key in how the fund will perform in the next whatever period that it applies. Sorry. Okay, are there any other questions or comment? Oh, Rebecca, sorry.
Yeah, apologies. This might be a daft one, and sorry if I missed something whilst I was scanning papers. But this is the document we're going to publish as our interim strategy. Does it say on it it's interim? And should it?
It doesn't. I suppose my view is it would be that it doesn't necessarily need to. I can add that if the general view is that the requirement that we have to meet is that we can separate. You can separate to a certain extent kind of investment strategy discussion from the statement. The statement is very much a technical requirement. The government requires that we publish one. It requires that we publish it in a certain format. which is why it's laid out as it is. And it requires that you refresh it at least every 3 years, ideally. And what you do is every time your investment strategy does change, your statement, or as in our case, you actually implement part of a previously planned strategy, that you update the statement to reflect that change. So again, it's the statement itself doesn't have to be something that is maintained for a full 3 years. What we're not required to do is say this is the fund's investment strategy statement from 2020 through to 2023. It's simply, provided we have a statement that reflects the current allocation of the fund, that is useful to the government in terms of, we have a requirement to set out certain facts about our investments, including what proportion of them we put on the London CIV. Provided all that information is up to date, essentially it's actually should be a reasonably live document that we just keep updating. What we've found in the past is when we do make a substantial change to asset allocation, because we've sort of revised we've revised the statement wholesale. Generally, we'll make a substantial change, and it'll then stay like that for a year or 18 months or 2 years before we refresh it again. But there's no, apart from needing to do it every 3 years, there is no hard and fast rule about once you've committed to this, you're stuck with it forever. It's very much just a case of when we change the strategy, we need to change the statement to reflect that.
So I'm not sure I know what the answer is, but I think we're not going to say.
Well, I was going to say, can I flip the question? It was just more that if stakeholders see it and we've not done any engagement, no one's going to be worried that we've gone ahead and done something without talking to them. I get that we can update it, but it's sort of the other side of it, that no one's going to think we've not engaged and we should have. I am happy to include, to add interim to it on that basis. I don't think it is likely to be an issue. There is a requirement on us whenever we make substantial changes to it to consult with relevant stakeholders. But obviously these are technical changes only to reflect work we've already done. So it's not something I would consider that we have a consultation. I don't consider that we have a consultation requirement for these changes. When it comes to a change following a review, yes, absolutely. Which generally, in this instance, the most relevant stakeholders you're looking at are the employers. So I think it's very much a case of I'm happy to include interim. We will send it out to them as a courtesy to make sure they've got the most up-to-date version. But I don't think there's a consultation requirement on this one.
And of course, we can explain what we're actually doing, can't we? When we send it out to people.
Yes.
On that basis, are we happy to call it the interim strategy? Sorry, does Michael want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that we add something into the introduction, just to say that we are undergoing a review of the investment strategy, and that will be reflected later on.
Yep. No, that seems a good way to approach it.
Okay, then shall we do that then?
The key for me is that the investment strategy statement reflects the current strategy, and that additional context sounds helpful.
Thank you, Andrew. So on that basis, then, can we approve the interim investment strategy statement as it says, for publication on the fund's website and within the annual report and accounts? Okay, thank you all very much.
Agreed.
Brings us on, kicking my microphone back on again, to the quarterly update. Now, we've only just had the quarterly update for a number of complicated reasons, but I'm sure you all understand the difficulties that we're all working under at the moment. Normally it's a pretty important document, but on this occasion it's really been superseded by most of the stuff that we covered under the COVID update. So I'd be less concerned about that than might have been normally. But I'll just pass back to Rachel to see if there's anything briefly that you wanted to say.
Yes. So first of all, apologies that this was sent round late. Secondly, I think what I would draw people's attention to is the fact that because of our reporting timetable, this quarterly update covers the period January to March 2020. So obviously the issue that we have here is simply that circumstances have changed quite considerably since the period to which the report relates. I suppose the most notable section I think I would draw everyone's attention to here are the funding and investment performance sections, which do give a breakdown of fund performance over that first quarter of the year. And clearly what that does show is the very sharp contraction in asset values that we experienced over that period. So obviously what it shows is the different impacts on essentially different sections of the fund's asset allocation. So you can see the very sharp contraction in equity valuations. You can see the difference actually between the fund's two multi-asset allocations, which performed very differently over the period. So Invesco actually remained very stable, whereas we saw a sharp drop on GMO. And you can also see the impact on the income and protection assets, which clearly were not quite as significantly affected. So it's very much just a case of providing a breakdown of that impact, but bearing in mind obviously that there have been quite considerable changes since the end of March. And B, just to really note that again, it's very much a snapshot. We take the view that it's really quite difficult to predict at the moment what the longer term impact is going to be, and that we wouldn't necessarily consider market reaction at the moment to be a satisfactory guide to what's likely to happen over the medium to longer term. Jonathan, I think you have a question.
Jonathan. Jonathan, you're muted. So I think you need to unmute. Can we unmute him, or does he have to leave? That's it.
Is that better? Is that better? Hello, everybody. My question actually is, what has happened to the BlackRock short bond fund just recently, please? Do we have any update on that?
Rachel?
In terms of just recently, do you have a particular timescale in mind?
I'm getting used to the technology here. Really, it's basically over the last 3 months, please.
Over the last 3 months, I can't give you an exact figure, but I can tell you that the valuation of that fund has remained very stable over the last 3 months. We have actually in the last couple of weeks, we've actually made a substantial redemption from that fund to fund a drawdown to the private debt mandates. But other than that, the actual valuation of the fund has been very stable.
Many thanks.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? I mean, given that most of us won't, as I said, to a large extent, the information's been superseded by the discussion we had following the COVID paper earlier. Most of us won't have a chance to have a look at this, or at least not in detail. So can I suggest if there's any detailed questions, you send them by email to Rachel, for follow up later. But having said that, are there any comments or questions now about it? In which case, can we note the report? Okay, thank you. Which brings us on to item 8, the contract extension. And I have to ask, it's complicated this, have to ask Andrew and Karen to lead meetings, and Anne, I guess, to move meetings that they're not technically at. How do we do that? Do you just vanish or what?
So I think what we might be able to do is hang up, and if you drop a message in chat, then we can come back in. But you will certainly see us disappear.
So Tess is on there, are you?
I'll drop you a message when
Okay,
you
then.
come back.
Right. So yeah, can you very briefly then, Rachel, say what we've got to do here? Why?
So this report relates to it's the fund's contract for benefits and governance consultancy, which we take from Aon and from Hymans. So what's happened with these contracts previously is that they were originally let in 2014 under the National LGPS framework's actuarial and benefits consultancy framework. So they were let for an original period of 4 years with an optional 2-year extension, which we requested from the committee and were granted. So what that means is that the contracts now have an expiry date of, I think it's the 31st of October 2020. The position that we're now in, originally, the LGPS framework under which we let the contracts was originally due to expire this year, and a new framework was due to be put in place. So our original intention would have been that in the summer of 2020, we had planned to re-let essentially we had planned to tender the contracts and let new contracts under the new framework. The position that we're in now is that Norfolk, who administer the frameworks programme, because of the issues they've had over coronavirus, have decided that they would apply for an extension of the framework into 2020. So I think the framework has now been extended to, I think it's July of 2021. So essentially the position that puts us in is we could choose to re-let our contracts under the old framework. However, that would limit the time that we could let them for, as well as meaning that we're actually letting contracts on a fairly old set of framework terms and conditions. The market has changed quite a bit in the 6 years since we let these contracts, and we would like to use the new framework. So essentially what we're asking for here is a 12-month extension on the contracts to allow us to use the new framework to let them in 2021. We have checked this with procurement. We're also supported. There are provisions as well in the public contracts regulations that essentially allow for extensions of this type in what is effectively an emergency situation, and that's the report's accompanied by I think it's a briefing note from the Cabinet Office that provides a bit of support for that viewpoint. Okay,
we're content it's legal. Are there any questions or comments on that, or can we agree this extension? Okay, that's agreed then. Thank you. That's all right. No comment. Right. Excellent. Thank you very much. So can we get our revisers back now?
Yes, let me just drop my message to come back again.
Okay, so we're going to have a session on infrastructure investment, which is well, I'll leave it to the officers to explain. But there is an in on this on our current investment strategy, but obviously it may or may not play a major part in our new one as well. So when we are ready to begin, I think what we've got is a brief introduction from Rachel, and then Andrew's going to do another short presentation, and then have a discussion about the issues. There is a confidential appendix. At some point, one of the officers is going to indicate that I should exclude the press and public. So, have we lost them?
I just had to message them to let them know to come back, because obviously they can't see the chat function. So
are you able
give
to
them a couple of minutes. They should be back in.
Andrew in later, or is that just going to be a waste of time?
Sorry?
Do you want to kick off, or is that not possible without Andrew?
Yes, no, I can do, and I'm happy to do so. Right, they should be back. They should be back any second.
Yeah,
so what this what this paper sets out is essentially it's looking at a possible use of the 0 to 5% opportunities pot that the fund designated a couple of years ago and has not previously made use of. So what we're recommending is that the up to 5%, and in this case we have made a recommendation of up to 5% is used for an allocation to infrastructure, which essentially we've split the recommendation slightly. First of all to recommend that the fund allocates up to 5% of its assets to infrastructure. And secondly, that the allocation is split between essentially a balanced infrastructure allocation, looking at a number of sectors, with potentially a dedicated renewables allocation in addition to that. So the way the recommendations are structured is to firstly approve in principle the overall allocation, but also then approve as the first part of implementing this, to focus on the renewables element of that allocation. And we're recommending that at present, although this could change in the future, that 30 to 50% of the total allocation be made to renewable infrastructure mandates. We've left the paper quite open in terms of how we might implement this, decision if it's agreed. We are at the moment we're part of a sort of early group with the London CIV, looking at how they could consider a renewable infrastructure mandate. Essentially, our preference would be that, however we do it, that we do look to collaborate with other, particularly London local authorities on this, if we're able to. So that could mean using the London CIV. It could mean a collaborative project. But essentially, we have left the implementation method reasonably open. Whilst obviously still recommending collaboration if we're able to do it. What the paper then sets out is it introduces infrastructure as an asset class, as well as looking in a little bit more detail at renewable infrastructure in particular. It considers the types of funds available, and then goes on to look at how we might implement a decision if it's approved by the committee. We've also got as part of the public session on this paper. I think Andrew is looking to present a few training slides on infrastructure as an asset class. So I'm not sure if you wanted to cover those now prior to questions, or if we talk through the paper itself first.
I would suggest, Andrew's hands, I think maybe it might, Andrew's presentation may well shine light on the whole thing, but I stand to be advised. Then we can come back. listen to Andrew, then come back to the discussion. Andrew?
Okay, I think Anna's sure. I think I was just going to say I think Anna's going to pick up on the training slides.
Anna, right, not Andrew. Okay, welcome, Anna.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Okay, this is the point where we have to exclude the press and public, since we're now referring.
No, I think these slides. I think we're happy. We're happy to keep
fine.
the training slides public.
Do let me know when that point arises. Okay, then. Welcome, Anna. Over to you then. If you could say who you are.
Sure. So I'm Anna Hawkins. I work with Andrew at Hymans Robertson. We're the investment consultants. Hopefully you can see my slides now. Can everybody see? Should be an infrastructure slide, yes. So this is a fairly brief overview of what infrastructure investment really is. I'm sure we're all familiar with some good examples, so things like pipelines, water networks, things like train lines, toll roads, cable networks, and then social kind of infrastructure, things like schools and hospitals. So essentially they're essential services and they tend to have monopolistic characteristics. So it's very hard for competitors to come into the market. And the result of that is that you have fairly predictable, stable returns. They tend to be less impacted by the wider business cycle. So, you know, kind of ups and downs, and I guess particularly things like COVID have less of an impact on infrastructure values than on other asset classes. And that's what makes it a really great investment for pension schemes, because you've got a regular, reliable income coming in. And it's less reliant on the values of the assets. Yes, Jonathan, I think you've got a question.
Anna, thank you. Can I just challenge you on what you just said about things like COVID, pandemics not affecting infrastructure assets? If there's a wholesale loss of traffic, people, and things like that, infrastructure gets affected, surely.
It absolutely does. Yeah, so it's not completely immune to that, definitely. But it really depends on how the asset is structured. So for some, obviously, if it's a toll road and you're dependent on people driving down the road to get those tolls, that will have an impact when people stop driving around. But a lot of these assets are structured so that the income comes in regardless of whether it's being used or not. So it's an agreement between two parties. So for example, things like schools and hospitals, the money comes in regardless of whether the school is actually being used at that point in time. So yes, you're completely right. Some of these assets will be affected by that, but as a general asset class, it's much less affected than things like equities and bonds, which have a direct impact straight away. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Okay, Anna, shall we carry on and maybe try and deal with, I mean, obviously if someone wants to interrupt to get a point of explanation, that's fine, but let's deal with most questions at the end if possible.
Sure. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide. There's obviously a range of different types of infrastructure investment. This just sets out a few examples, ranging from lower risk, lower expected return on the left-hand side up to higher risk and higher expected return on the right-hand side. And when you look at this, really the two on the left-hand side they've got a focus on the income that you're getting from the asset. They're more like the income assets that Andrew was talking about earlier. On the right-hand side, there's more of a focus on growth. So the underlying asset value is a key component as well. So that's kind of closer to the growth assets that you're holding already. Just to give you a few more details on this, on the left-hand side, brownfield is really looking at assets that are already up and running. They're pretty regular, pretty predictable income that you're going to get from them, and we wouldn't expect to make much of a change to the asset once you invest in it. So you're really looking at a fairly stable, fairly predictable flow of income, often inflation linked, and often in kind of very regulated industries. As you move up towards the right, we're looking at less stable income and potentially more development risk. So as you get into the value add and the opportunistic categories, you're looking at assets which potentially already exist, but where you're making either doing some development, doing some renovation, or expanding the existing assets. So as well as that income stream that you know, you've got a bit more of an unknown element in that anything that involves development or construction obviously has extra risk involved. And right up on the right hand side we've got greenfield, which is basically starting from the very beginning of a project. So you've obviously got all of the development and construction risk in that, which increases the risk, but it also increases the potential expected returns from that. Just because you need to take investors need more expected return to take on that added risk. And just to touch on why we would invest in infrastructure, there's obviously pros and cons as with any asset class. In particular, we're looking at very long-term assets, which is a great match. I know we've talked earlier about how pension schemes have a very long duration, and infrastructure investments also have that. They've got a long income stream. The return is you've got a high income component in the return, and they tend to be linked to inflation as well, which again provides a good match for the benefits that you're paying out. And then, like I said, they're fairly resilient, predictable, and also the correlation between infrastructure and other asset classes is relatively low, partly because of that low volatility. So it gives you a bit of extra protection in terms of if equity markets or bond markets do something significant, that it gives you a bit of extra diversification. There's obviously downsides. Infrastructure has been around for a long time, and it's something that a lot of pension funds haven't invested in until relatively recently. One of the issues is that the fees tend to be quite high. Traditionally, they have been prohibitively high for a lot of pension fund investors. They have been coming down now, and we think it's more affordable now than it has been in the past. There's also in terms of how we actually implement an infrastructure investment, a lot of the funds are closed-ended funds. So you sign up to the fund before you necessarily know all of the underlying assets it's going to hold. And then the fund has a fixed term at outset. So as it comes to the end of that term, the assets need to be sold, which means you might not get the full value that you would expect from that asset if you'd been holding it for the full term of the asset's life. That again, there are now ways that we can work around that, but it's something to be aware of. There's a few other things here that I guess the key one is the lack of benchmark in terms of performance monitoring. So it's not like an equity investment or a bond investment where there are lots of alternatives and lots of indices that you can track to monitor the performance and understand how it's performing. And because the underlying investments tend to be bespoke one-off investments, it can be harder to benchmark against other alternative investments, and sometimes to fully understand what the underlying investments are doing. I won't go through all of the risks in this. Many of them are similar to the risks that you have with other asset classes. Things like cost and liquidity won't be a surprise. A couple of infrastructure specific risks here, things like regulatory risk. So when you're looking at particularly regulated industries, if the regulations change, which means that the income is restricted or capped, that can have an impact on income. Operational risk and management risk. If you're setting up and running a project, then you've got there is a risk that that things go wrong. Like you say, Jonathan, that things like COVID happen. and catastrophe risk, I guess, would fall under that category as well. That your school is destroyed, your power station stops working. So those are probably more infrastructure specific, but it's similar to any asset class. There are risks and there's rewards for that, for taking that risk. That's really everything I was going to say on the slides. Are there any questions so far?
Any questions or comments? Right, we're going to deal with the renewable infrastructure specifically at this stage, or someone going to say something about that separately?
Rob, can I just ask something, maybe just to just a clarification about listed infrastructure investment and the unlisted infrastructure investment? If you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So listed infrastructure, it is obviously available. It's much easier to invest in. We tend not to recommend listed infrastructure in this context for a couple of reasons. One is that it's quite closely correlated to equity investment, so you lose the benefit of the diversification. It also tends to, because it's liquid investment, you lose the illiquidity premium that you get from investing in unlisted infrastructure. So as a pension fund, you can afford to tie up a certain amount of your assets for a certain period of time, and as a reward for doing that, you get an illiquidity premium. So if you invest in unlisted infrastructure, then you can do that. You sign up for, say, sort of 8, 10, 12 years, and you get an illiquidity premium in respect of that. If you're investing in listed infrastructure, you can sell it much more quickly. It's much more liquid, but you don't get that illiquidity premium. So a portion of the return that you would expect from investing in infrastructure, you lose. Does that help? Is there anything else?
Thank you. That's fine.
I think Henry, did you have a question?
No, I just want to say I'm pretty biased here, but I'm a huge fan of infrastructure. I think it's a perfect match for pension, so I would definitely go for it. I think our percent minimum is probably a bit low, but we've got to build up. We've got to start from somewhere. Personally, I think renewable energy is now starting to really take off. I'd really push that threshold up beyond 50%, up to 70%. And I'm glad that you included connectivity there, because everybody thinks of infrastructure as physical. But as we've seen the last 3 months, it's non-physical infrastructure is clearly almost more important. And so something, I'm glad that that's included. So we should try and get that in the holding. I suppose I'm sold on it. I think it's such a good fit for pension funds. And the question really is, how do we go into it, whether it's a fund of funds or a pooled fund or something? I think we probably need to be in a reasonably big pool to have an impact. But my view is, let's go for it. I think it's such a good fit.
Thanks, Henry. There are a few different, and I think the paper that we've got at Appendix 1 sets out a few of the options for sort of how we might implement this. So we could potentially use a fund of funds. There are potentially collaborative options available. So the London CIV uses Stepstone essentially as a sort of outsourced head of infrastructure, and they have put together. At the moment, it's a balanced portfolio, but potentially that could be widened to include a sort of dedicated renewables option available for the London CIV.
Are we into the appendix now?
So, Rob, it depends how you would like to treat this.
Yeah, shall we include the press and public? Just to put that on the record. I know it's a bit silly, but we have to do that, yeah? And then let's move on, yeah? Okay.
Yes, my only question for that